This is Limitless Spirit, a practical, inspirational, and thought-provoking weekly podcast about the impact of faith and Christian identity in today's world. And now here's your host, champion of Jesus and people who love him, world traveler and co-founder of World Missions Alliance, Helen Todd.
Thank you for tuning in to the Limitless Spirit podcast. We have a very important conversation today. Apparently, COVID-19 pandemic is not the only pandemic that we should watch out for. Loneliness. It's an epidemic that affects 2 in 5 Americans and has the negative effect on health equal of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Some studies show that continual loneliness can lead to inflammation, which makes the body susceptible to numerous illnesses. So really, as we're trying to protect our immune systems during this COVID-19 pandemic, loneliness can be really life-threatening. And of course, the quarantine and the lockdowns have made matters worse, and especially if you're among 35.7 million Americans who live alone. These are pretty staggering numbers. According to a chart in the May issue of Time magazine, here's the profile of the loneliest person in America, a male in the age group 18 to 22, making under $25,000 a year and living either alone or with more than 2 other people in the household. So really, loneliness is not just about lack of companionship. It's about not belonging to anything. It's about not being heard, not being understood. The article in Time magazine, of course, went on to say that we should embrace digital communication to solve the problem. But the problem is much deeper than the lack of personal interactions. There's another effect that loneliness has on our lives. I recently read a brilliant essay by Evan Belosa, and it's titled Loneliness, Radicalization, and the Fate of Democracy. It was written 3 years ago, but it is extremely applicable to what is happening in our society today. And really, to me, it explains how COVID-19 pandemic made all these issues that we have been struggling with inflamed and erupt into this terrible mess. If you have 18 minutes to spare, I'm posting a link to this article in the show notes, and it is extremely well written. But if you don't have time to read it, I will give you the gist of the article. Basically, he's talking about the fact that historically, America depended on communities on the local level, family, local government, church, Boy Scouts, PTA. It created the sense of belonging among Americans and really made America the country that it was and it was meant to be. But the sense of community, the fabric of American community has deteriorated through the last 2 centuries. It's the divorce rate, the dissolving family ties and relationships, the declining birth rate, internet, smartphones, social media. All of this has attributed to the fact that Americans have become lonelier and lonelier. And apparently churches have failed to provide the substitution for the non-existent family relationships. Because let's face it, the trend within the church right now is less and less focus on socializing within the church families. And so Evan Belosa goes on to say that loneliness drives people to the fringes of political partisanship. And that is a threat to our democracy. And he comes to the conclusion that people do that because belonging to an angry mob is better than not belonging to anything or anyone. And I agree with him. So for today's conversation, I invited York Moore. He's an evangelist, a philosopher, and an author. Together with Gary Chapman, he co-wrote a book titled Seen, Known, Loved, and he believes this book provides a lasting solution and answers that speak to the very root of human loneliness. Hello, York. Welcome to the Limitless Spirit podcast.
Hey, Helen, thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you about your new book, Seen, Known, Loved, 5 Truths About God and Your Love Language. I understand it just came out recently.
Yeah, we're very excited about it. Dr. Gary Chapman and I put our brains together, and what we're really hoping this book will become is kind of a more than a carpenter for an emotionally intelligent and sophisticated generation, so that people can understand God's love and they can experience God's love.
I think it's a great subject, and I also think that it's very timely because we are living in a society right now that is very divided. I feel like this type of division, at least I have not experienced this in my lifetime, and there has to be a root to it. And I've been thinking about this, and there are studies that support the idea that we are living in the time when there's an epidemic of loneliness. And in fact, I read the study that shows that 2 out of 5 Americans are experiencing isolation, loneliness, and do not feel that they have any meaningful relationships in their lives.
The solution is a concept that I call togetherness, and there's a lot of writing on this. In fact, you can read some of the writing from the Health and Resource and Services Administration nonprofit that has some studies on loneliness. But this idea of togetherness is not just having relationships; it's this idea of belonging to one another. And so if loneliness is a pandemic, how do we actually combat that? We invest in togetherness. And here, Helen, here's one of the most beautiful truths about the Christian religion, is that ultimately all of divine history is moving toward this moment where God declares the tabernacle or the dwelling of God is now amongst mortals. In other words, that God is now dwelling, living in the midst of us. And that idea of togetherness grows out of that reality that we're made in the image of a communal God, and that what God wants most is to dwell or tabernacle with us.
That is very interesting. When I was reading your book, you mentioned your personal story of growing up in a family that were not just atheists, but were openly hostile towards God, to the point that your family had a bin for Bibles that they were intending to burn. And so, from that background, you made this complete change in your belief system and became a Christian, and not just a Christian, but a minister of the gospel. Share a little bit about your story. How did that transformation happen?
Well, I'll tell you this, I wasn't looking for God, that's for sure. In fact, in addition to that bin for burning Bibles, when we weren't homeless, we had a sign in the front of our home that said, "The Moors, the atheists." And so we were ardent atheists. My first name is Rand. The R in R York Moore stands for Rand. I'm named after an atheistic philosopher named Ayn Rand, who was the
Really?
yeah.
That's so interesting. And she was a woman.
Yes, she was. Yes, and she was the founder of Objectivism, which is a pretty hostile version of atheism. And so I
Right.
was steeped in this philosophy all my life. And but I'll tell you, my journey with God actually began when I was 6 years old, sitting in that home with that sign on the front of the home, minding my own business, playing in the bathtub, when I actually heard the voice of God. And I began to have a conversation at the age of 6 with a God who saw me, who knew me, who loved me, and who intervened. And in the midst of that conversation, my parents came in and they said, "Well, who are you speaking to, Rand York?" And I said, "Well, I'm speaking to God." And they said, with a great disappointment, they said, "Oh, we thought we explained to you God doesn't exist, and that people who believe that God exists, they're making it up. They're fabricating it so that they can have easy lives." And so, being the naive 6-year-old that I was, I looked back at the ceiling and I said, "Well, God, my parents say you don't exist, and so I have to stop speaking to you." And that began the first day of the next 14 years of my life, living as if there is no God. And after that, the normal pattern of brokenness, of early sexual promiscuity and experimentation with substances, and those kinds of things were kind of par for the course. But when I went to college, I went to the greatest university in America, the University of Michigan, go blue. And there I fell in love with learning. I double majored. I was an honors student both in the philosophy department and the applied psychology department with statistics. And persecuted Christians, wrote papers against Christians. And in fact, my nickname on campus, Helen, was Satan, because I was known for persecuting Christians. And then I became one. And that wasn't by choice. Of course, I made the decision to follow Jesus, but I wasn't looking for God. In fact, I had come to the belief that since there is no God, life can have no meaning, there can be no purpose. And if life doesn't have purpose, why live at all? And so I made a rational decision to commit suicide. I know that might sound strange to some listeners, but it wasn't sufficient for me to just continue to live life day by day for momentary pleasures, for the acclamation of wealth and power. Those were insufficient reasons to live. If you're going to die and cease to exist, why not die today? And so before I made that, ultimate decision, I did decide to just investigate, because I didn't want to make a decision and then find out in eternity that I was wrong. And I knew that I had studied enough religions that I knew that, well, if it was Buddha or Krishna, I'd have a few opportunities to get it right. And if it was Allah, I could work myself out of hell. But this Jesus character was a real problem, because I had heard Christians say things like, it's appointed unto us once to die and then to face judgment. And so I only had to exclude Jesus. Well, it all came to a head December 24th. I'm sitting in the movie theater watching The Little Mermaid in the theater that will date me. And I had also began to pray. I said, well, God, if you're there, Allah, Buddha, Krishna, Jesus, he, she, it, whoever you may be, demonstrate it. Show me. And I was looking for skywriting or the angel Moroni to show up at my doorstep, and none of those things happened. And yet here I am in a Christian nation, on the verge of a national Christian holiday, watching The Little Mermaid, and I thought to myself, this is it. It doesn't matter what background you come from. The only thing in life is pleasure, entertainment, distraction, and so I decided to kill myself. And so I got my fiance dropped off, and I got my little red sports car going about 90 miles an hour down the freeway, and my plan was to smash it on the viaduct near my home. And as I got that twisted sense of courage to kill myself, fully intending to do it, I aimed my car at the viaduct, and in that moment of decision, the presence and the power of God swept into that vehicle, taking hold of that wheel. See, I'm the original Jesus Take the Wheel story. I should be getting royalties on that song, but I haven't seen any money yet. But that experience with God, just like that experience at the age of 6, was so visceral, was so real, that it stopped me in my tracks. And I got home that night in a cold sweat. I woke up the next morning in a cold sweat, and for the first time, Helen, I prayed a prayer of desperation. And I said, God, if that was you last night, I need to know today, because I'm still going to kill myself. Now, I walked into the next room, and no Christians in my family, but I had 2 other brothers who were also studying at the greatest university in America, the University of Michigan. And they had brought a picture frame of the poem, Footprints in the Sand. And I had read it before. It's a simple poem about how God sees us and provides for us even when we're unaware of his presence. But this time, as I'm reading this poem, I heard the voice of God just as clearly as I had heard him in the bathroom. And he said 3 things to me that changed my forever. He said, number 1, I do exist. He said, number 2, I'm the reason why you exist. Now, those 2 data points for a philosopher are all you need. From those 2 data points, we can derive all kinds of things. If God created me, then I must exist for his purpose. But the 3rd thing blew me away. He said, number 3, I'm the one who kept you from killing yourself last night, which meant that God knew me, he saw me, and he loved me enough to actually enter into my story and save me from my own self-destruction.
This is a very interesting story, and it really resonates with me because I too grew up in a family of atheists, except I don't think they were atheists by choice, because I grew up in the Soviet Union and everybody had to be an atheist. But, I had a very similar experience as a little child, maybe 5 even years old, talking to God, even though I didn't knew he was there. So as I was listening to your story, I thought, wow, this is almost like a pattern. And the way I got saved was through a gospel tract that somebody just handed out in the streets of Moscow, and handed it to my brother, who brought it home, and he didn't read it, but I did. And what drew me to even trying out the idea of God was that he loved me so much that he gave his son on the cross for me. And I thought, if love like this exists, I want this love. And so I took a chance and I invited him into my heart, and my life has never been the same since.
Praise
So
God.
it's interesting that there are a lot of similarities in this story.
The reality is most atheists, at least in the United States, are not real atheists. They're occasional atheists that use the veneer of atheism to live a life of self-indulgence and sin. But in reality, unfortunately, in the church, many people are what I call functional atheists. They say the right things, but they live as if there is no God. And so part of the reason why Dr. Gary Chapman and I wrote this book was very much like your encounter with this track. So this book is not a track, but it is what we call kind of like the more than a carpenter for an emotionally intelligent and sophisticated generation. I mean, this generation has been raised on Dr. Phil and Oprah. They're in touch with their emotions. They understand the Enneagram and in the Myers-Briggs, and so what we decided to do is to write a book that would help people experience the love of God. Very, very much like your story. Reading that track, you were swept away with the reality. If this love is true, I have to experience it for myself, and that's the hope that we've written this book with the hope that millions of people will experience for the first time the love of Jesus by reading this book. So in this book, one of the things that I've done over the last 30 years as an evangelist, I have kind of discovered what I believe are the 5 heart hopes, the great core aspirations of most people, right? So we all have lots of hopes and dreams and aspirations, but I believe that there are 5 core aspirations and that there's a one-to-one correspondence with these love languages. I'll give you a couple of illustrations, Helen. For instance, a person whose love language is gifts. And I have 3 kids, and my second kid, she experiences love viscerally through gifts. Well, what she's really striving for is to experience a sense of worth and value. And so people who are gift givers, that's what they're saying. They're asking the question, do I have worth? My son, my firstborn, he's a quality time kind of guy. He wants to spend as much time. It doesn't matter if I give him gifts, if I give him words of praise. All of that is wasted on him. But if I spend quality time with him, he experiences love. Well, for a person like that, what their heart hope is really asking is, am I known deeply? Does anybody care about me? Am I connected to somebody in a deep way? And so over the course of the 30 years, as I've led tens of thousands of people to Christ through my evangelistic ministry, I've discovered by and large that everybody has one core driving aspiration. And then later on, as I got to be familiar with Dr. Gary Chapman's work, primarily through my early married years, my wife and I went through his material, and it really helped us quite a bit, revolutionized our marriage. I began to realize there's really a strong correlation between what I call heart hopes and what Gary calls love languages. So this book, you can put this book in the hand of your niece, your nephew, your Uber driver, your hairstylist, your neighbor, and regardless of their love language, they can understand how God loves them and how God is the ultimate source of fulfillment for everything that they've been created for, right? Give you one last illustration. A person whose love language is acts of service, almost always what they're really after is trying to answer this question: am I having an impact? Am I making a difference? Will I leave a legacy? Right? And so what we've done is we've connected Gary's love languages with my heart hopes, and we're hoping that that secret sauce will really connect with millions of readers around the world.
I love the idea behind this book. I lead a missions organization that works in 29 countries around the world, and I see this as a wonderful tool to reach people, because you're right. The need to be loved, understood, heard, seen is the basic need of every human being all around the world. And ultimately, when we share the gospel with people, we're trying to communicate that very simple message: God loves you. There is nothing else that can draw a person to God, to Jesus, faster and more effectively than the idea that there is a deity all-powerful creator of the universe who knows you personally and loves you. And so I see this as a fantastic evangelistic tool. But let's talk about the most practical aspect of it. So what does it mean to feel God's love?
Well, I think we experience love differently depending on how we're wired, how we're created. Again, going back to my three kids, my youngest, she's a physical touch kind of girl. By contrast, her sister has, a kind of a mild form, a disorder where physical touch, actually, she experiences that as a negative, right? And so we're raising her whole life, and we couldn't understand why we could never hug her, we could never kiss her, she didn't want to be tucked in at night. And then we began to realize, oh, well, this is probably a significant disorder. Now, I share that as by way of illustration, Helen, because it might not be to that extreme, but you'll have a relationship with one person, and you think that you're doing things that are expressions of love and care for them, and they can literally be experiencing it as hostility or a lack of disregard. I remember as a young married man, my love language is words of affirmation. So in my mind, everybody should be loved through words of affirmation. And if I tell you I love you, then that should settle the matter, right? You should experience love simply because I've said it. Well, that's not my wife's love language. It's my wife's love language is acts of service. And so I remember very early on, she was angry, very bitter about very simple things that I wasn't doing. And, I would apologize. I would tell her I loved her. But no matter how much I told her verbally that I loved her, she wasn't feeling it. She wasn't experiencing love because she was wired to experience love through expressions of service. And once I got that, thanks to Gary Chapman, it revolutionized my marriage. And just like that, when it comes to the love of God, one person isn't experiencing the love of God through one language, because we're trying to explain it or help them experience it through ours, right? And so, for instance, when we did the field testing for this book, we did extensive field testing with non-Christians for this book. Readers will go through one chapter, two chapters, and then they'll get to that magic chapter that is their love language. And all of a sudden, their heart is set on fire. Just recently, a couple of days ago, a waitress, read this book, non-Christian waitress, and she came back and she said, for the first time, I want to read the Bible. For the first time, I want to hear what God has to say to me, because she found that magic chapter that helped her connect her story with God's story. So I think basically what I'm trying to say here, Helen, is that we experience or feel love differently by design. And the great news is that God speaks our love language. God knows who we are. He sees us where we're at, and he loves us deeply. If we're in acts of service, a quality time, a word of affirmation, there is a way in which God is trying to connect with us. And this simple evangelistic book helps people experience that, connecting them to the Word of God so that they can go deeper in their relationship with Christ.
Well, you mentioned that one of your daughters, her love language is a physical touch. So how do you feel touched by God?
Yeah, so in the chapter, we talk about what does it actually mean to be hugged by God. And I go to a passage in Isaiah, a very hard time for the people of God. They were being exiled. They were being marched off to a new civilization. And they're crying out to be reminded that God is with them, right? And there's this whole passage and this whole buildup about what does it actually mean to be hugged by God. We're hugged by God in all kinds of ways. I was talking to somebody just today, and she said, I didn't think that God cared about me during this COVID pandemic. I couldn't experience his presence. And then all of a sudden, and she went through several kind of experiences all in one day. The sun rose in a beautiful way. She experienced the specific words from several people that reminded her of God's presence and power. The reality is that we oftentimes discount God's active work in our lives. There's a way in which we should experience every breeze, every beautiful flower at our feet, every smile. And I know that's hard because we're all behind masks now, but every smile from a stranger, every sunset, every sunrise, we should experience those as the very kiss of God, as the very hug of God. And so even though God is invisible to us now, The good news is that the whole story of God is culminating in this great place where we will dwell with God. We will be in his presence. We will be embraced with him in a literal sense. But right now, where we're at, God is embracing us. He is holding us. He is kissing us through many, many ways.
Well, and I think, because as I was going through your book, I was trying to identify each one of these languages and, how do I understand it even before I read how you explain it. And I think the hug could be also just recognizing the beauty around us, his creation, the beauty of his creation that he created for us, for our pleasure, for our use. Even that is. This is how we experience him visibly, is through what he created.
Yeah.
And love itself, he created it for us and for our pleasure. That's like a hug from him.
Yeah, I think that's what's so addictive for non-Christians about physical nature. I mean, you look at people who will spend their entire lives pursuing the most beautiful mountain peak. I have a niece who's a global Ironman competitor, and she will go to the ends of the earth to compete in some of the most beautiful, beautiful places. In my last book, Do Something Beautiful, which we're not talking about on this recording, but in my last book, I go into great depths about why the physical beauty of the earth is so alluring. It's almost like a drug. It's intoxicating. And I do believe that when we allow ourselves to actually be immersed in the physical beauty of the world, we have that moment. Every single one of us. You can take the most hardened atheist and you put them in front of a rainbow or a waterfall or a vast ocean or a field of flowers, and there's something in them that connects with the divine. Because the physical beauty of the world, the natural created order of the world, is one of the ways that we're embraced by God. The whole world cries out glory. The whole world points to the magnificence and the glory of God. And that is one of the ways that we are actually embraced by God. The other way, Helen, is that we're embraced through other people. God puts people in our lives. There's a widow in my church who recently said to me, I haven't been hugged in 4 months. Well, guess how she gets hugged from God? Through the church, through people who are in her life, who care for her and love her. So we're loved by God through nature, and we're loved by God through people. We're loved by God in all kinds of ways, regardless of how we were created to experience that love. God is speaking our love language and loving us every moment of our lives.
So, going back to the beginning of our conversation, how do you feel the understanding God's love helps us fix the issue, the problem of loneliness in our lives?
It goes back to that concept of togetherness. When we experience togetherness, it helps us almost like a sphere or an interpretive grid to make sense of ourselves, of our world, of eternity, of our purpose. When we are together, right, we experience life the way it was supposed to be lived. And the tragedy of loneliness is that it doesn't just create physical and psychological maladies, it actually reduces us to something subhuman. And so when we find our identity in the context of community with God and with others, we become who we were created to be, and it's electric. When we come into a relationship with God, everything makes sense. We live life the way it was intended. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have problems. Our streets are filled with violence, with misunderstanding. There are disagreements and all kinds of problems. But the reality is that even in the midst of this storm that we're experiencing now, this terrible year that we call 2020, even in the midst of this storm, when we have the love of God in our lives, we are rooted. Everything makes sense. We might not like it, but at least we understand it. And we have the capacity to not just survive, but to thrive. Those people who are truly rooted in Jesus, the year of 2020 is going to cause them to thrive, to become a better version of themselves because of the love of God.
I do agree with York Moore. We must not give up on the year 2020 just yet. For myself, I call this year a wake-up call. It has brought to light the intensity of the problems that have been brewing for a long time. It has pushed us all out of complacency. And I'm specifically talking about the church, the followers of Christ. It is up to us to lead the way and be proactive when it comes to the problems and issues in our society rather than reactive. I want to finish with the poem by John Donne. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. I appreciate you listening to the Limitless Spirit podcast. If you have not yet subscribed to it, you can do it on your favorite podcast platform or on the website rfwma.org/forward-podcasts. I always look forward to receiving your emails with your comments and suggestions. You can email them to podcast@rfwma.org. And if you feel like you enjoy it and you want to help us continue produce these podcasts, simply go to rfwma.org/forward-give. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Limitless Spirit with Helen Todd, produced by World Missions Alliance. Are you ready to step out of your comfort zone? Do you have a passion to help people and share your faith across the globe? Visit our website, rfwma.org, and get involved in the Great Commission through short-term missions. We hope you'll leave a review and check out other episodes. We'll be with you in a week on our next episode of Limitless Spirit.